What is up, everyone? Welcome to this week's edition of the Touchline Talk Show. Thank you so much for tuning in. Yes, it's the international break. We still have plenty to talk about, though. We are going to get to the U.S. men's national team, set the stage for these final two friendlies before the World Cup squad is announced. And of course, the team actually goes to Qatar for their first World Cup since 2014. But before we do that, I want to take some time to talk about biggest winners and losers of the European season so far, with this being that first international break. It's a nice check-in point. And my goal here is generally to highlight some of the teams that I don't talk about on a consistent, week in, week out basis because they're not necessarily the headline games in their league, that the marquee matchups every single weekend. There are some big names in here, but there are also some teams I haven't gotten to talk about very much. So, without further ado, we will begin 3 winners, 3 losers. I cheated a little bit on winner number 1. I'm just going to simply put the 2 teams at the top of the Serie A table together in Atalanta and Napoli. They're the only 2 undefeated teams left in Serie A. They have at least a 3-point cushion on every team in the league not named Udinese. And I did talk about this a little bit on Monday, this idea that they do have this cushion on the other 5 teams you look at as at least top 4 contenders, if not title contenders, depending on what year it is and how you feel about those clubs, right? There are 6 traditional powers, if you will, in Italy. And then Atalanta have certainly thrown themselves into that category with their recent success. We'll stick with Atalanta first. And they were one of the most interesting teams in Europe to me heading into the season. I think I've mentioned this before. Just in the sense of, what do you do next? What happens when you do have that bad season? Right? They're not in European competition. They just stopped scoring a ridiculous amount of goals last season. And that defense was not fantastic by any stretch of the imagination. So all of a sudden they went from being a really good team to being a rather average one. It really was that simple. If you look at their numbers from last season, it paints a very clear picture of what happened. Well, so far things have been interesting because they've allowed 3 goals. That's the fewest in Serie A. We're still very early. I'm not entirely convinced they've all of a sudden turned into this terrific defensive team. The numbers also, if you look at expected goals, suggest that might not be the case. And they are scoring at a little bit lower rate than even last season. But this is a much more sustainable model for success if they can continue to perform this way and continue to win games this way. There is always that risk, and it's, quite frankly, it's what has prevented them from going to even greater heights. When you play so wide open and there are so many goals scored in your games, both by you and the other team, you just don't have a lot of control over things. It is the natural risk that comes with it. So sometimes things are going to go badly and it's going to cost you points that if you're a little more pragmatic, maybe you can find a way to sort of navigate games more effectively. And so far, that's what Atalanta are doing. They haven't been spectacular week in and week out, but they're getting the results they need. And so the raw numbers in terms of goal difference and stuff like that, and of course points, looks really good. And also part of this is probably the benefit of not having to deal with Europe. This is a team that I would argue has a lot of depth just because of the amount of players. It seems like every season, right? There are these new players coming in, guys getting back from loan deals across Europe. It's not like they're reliant on 11 guys. But now you have the ability to really focus solely on Serie A and just put all of your efforts there, that one game every week. And so far, it's paying dividends for Atalanta. On the Napoli side, still lead Serie A in shot creating actions and goal creating actions. Offensively, they've been absolutely terrific, and they haven't been too bad defensively. I expected Napoli to take a step back with everything they lost, but very quietly, they had a phenomenal transfer window when it was all said and done by the time the window closed. You don't have one striker. Now you have 3. You certainly replaced Kalidou Koulibaly, and the way things have gone for him at Chelsea, maybe it ended up being a replacement. I'm hesitant to say that about Koulibaly because of how good he was for so long for Napoli. But these players, these club legends that have left, they're just not missing them. The players, and Victor Osimhen gets hurt, no problem. The other strikers step up. You still have your difference makers, your Peter Zielinskis of the world. And the other part of this, and why Napoli has to be one of my winners, is they are carrying the torch for all of Italy in European competition, not just the Champions League. The Europa League teams each have a bad loss. Fiorentina, not going well in the Europa Conference League. Lazio just got their doors blown off. Roma lost their first game. And then, of course, you have AC Milan have been fine. Inter have been disappointing. Juventus, we'll get to them in a minute. There is one team that is having so far, a very successful time in Europe, and that is Napoli. Never in a million years with that group and the circumstances surrounding the start of this season for Napoli did I think that would be the case. But here we are. They're off to a fantastic start. And the way these teams keep dropping points, this is a wide open title race. We need to get another 4 months into the season before I believe Atalanta and Napoli can actually go the distance with this and be there in the final games of the season contending for a title. That's what happened to Napoli last year, right? They were in this thing, and then all of a sudden, last month, 2 months of the season, it fell off the rails. You got to prove to me that's not going to happen again. But when you look at teams that have benefited from how things have gone so far, Atalanta and Napoli definitely near the top of that list. And we're just going to stay in Italy and talk about Juventus as the loser. It's just been so horrendous that I couldn't dismiss Juventus, even though I have talked about them before. I was trying to get some different teams in here. But 8th in the table, 7th in goals scored, 11th in expected goals per FBref, 11th in expected goals allowed, and 10th in expected goal difference. Dusan Vlahovic hasn't scored a goal from the run of play since the opening game of the season. He had those 2 brilliant free kicks, but in terms of actually just scoring a goal while the game is going on and the ball is not dead, is nowhere to be found. I have talked about some of this before in terms of their struggles, but you look at what is happening around them. With the vulnerabilities both Milan clubs have shown, Juventus should absolutely, regardless of whether you just, right, there's the argument that Juventus should always be contending for the Serie A title because they're Juventus, and there's certainly validity to that. But even just in the circumstances where Juventus are clearly in a rebuilding mode, the Milan clubs are in a really good place. But look at the points they've dropped already. The door is wide open for Juventus to get right back in there and, if not win the league, make a real run at it. And here they are, sitting in the middle of the table, and the Champions League has been an absolute disaster. They should be getting out of that Champions League group. Regardless of where they are, sort of in their cycle, they should be getting out of that group, even if they're not the Juventus that was getting to Champions League finals. Even if they're not anywhere close to that, which they aren't. You look at that and you expect them to be the second team in that group. And they are in real danger of that not happening because they've already lost a head-to-head at home with Benfica. Simply can't do it. Can't do it. So, I don't think there's too much that needs to be explained in this one. It's just kind of there written for you. You look at Juventus across any competition, and it's been disastrous from the very beginning. Basically from game one. And I was optimistic after the first couple. I was willing to forgive a draw. And I just can't, we're past the point of me saying I can't defend this anymore. It just continues to get worse and worse and worse. And it's a strange decision when you talk about Max Allegri too, just because at some point you have to back somebody to turn this around and actually have that hard conversation about we're just not where we need to be. We can't expect this to turn around quickly. Also, you need to make sure you get in the Champions League next season. It's not that this is disappointing, it's that this is disastrous. So if it continues, you're going to be in a really, really tough space when it comes to Max Allegri. As much as you may want to back him, you can't back anybody at the expense of not making the Champions League. Winner number 2, we're going to move to Germany. Union Berlin, no surprise here considering they're the only remaining undefeated team in the Bundesliga. They are atop the Bundesliga at the moment. It is worth pointing out, though, they are 11th in the league with a minus 0.4 expected goal difference, again per FBref. However, 3 of their 5 wins have come by multiple goals. It's not like they are finding sort of bizarre ways to win these games. They are, by and large, performing at a level from a score standpoint representative of the points they have put up on the board. Jordan Pefok, Geraldo Becker have 9 goals and 6 assists in the Bundesliga between them. What I see when I look at these numbers and watch Union Berlin is this is a good example of why expected goals need to be taken with a grain of salt. If Pefok and Becker keep finishing at this rate and taking their chances the way they are, I mean, the difference between their individual expected goals and the goals they've scored is remarkable. They have been ruthlessly efficient. If that continues, this is a sustainable model. You don't have to win the XG battle every single game to be a good team. When you're not Bayern Munich, inherently, right, they're just not built to possess the ball 70% of the time and win the expected goals almost by default. Bayern's still winning the XG battle every single game. Nobody's arguing they're playing well right now. Right? It's about the quality of chances you create and your ability, and ultimately, your ability to capitalize on the chances that are presented to you that you make for yourself. If you've got lethal strikers, 100% you can do it this way. The next team I'm going to talk about won a title doing it this way. The question is, can you do it for 25, 30, 34, ultimately 34 games? And there's also the part of this that, right, success for Union Berlin is not winning the Bundesliga. Getting into the Champions League would be a massive accomplishment, and they're in a really good position to do that. The other reason I wanted to include them in winners is the other teams that you're theoretically competing with for those final couple Champions League spots have not performed well by and large. It's not just that Union Berlin have been great. It's that they're in a terrific position, regardless of whether they can sustain this or not. If they can just play well enough, they're going to end up in the Champions League next season. And that's a massive win. So there's that part of it too. And the final thing I want to say, yeah, the Europa League hasn't gone great. It's not shocking, right? There's a track record of teams not used to having those midweek games, struggling to kind of put everything together and stay competitive in all of the different competitions they're in. But there is still plenty of time to turn that around and find. All you got to do is just get out of your group and go from there. Maybe it doesn't happen. Obviously, they're in a bad spot. But it's not like the European adventure is already over for them either. Loser number 2, Leicester City. I was honestly expecting to be talking about a managerial change here. So we'll talk about the team instead. Minus 12 goal difference. They've allowed 22 goals in 7 games. And they are already 3 points back of it. At least 3 points back of every other team in the Premier League. Now, some context is important here, and I want to start with this before we get to all of the bad. 7 games, 5 of which came against Arsenal, Chelsea, Manchester United, Tottenham, and Brighton. That does need to be part of the conversation here. And they nearly got a point against Chelsea. Now, they also gave up 2 goals up a man. They weren't bad against Arsenal. They just conceded the goal both times they actually scored to get back into the game. They didn't really offer much offensively against Manchester United, but they were in that game. You could argue they outplayed Tottenham in the first half. Now they gave up 4 goals in the second half. They had a lead against Brighton. I mean, it lasted for all of 10 minutes or something. So when you look at that and you look at some of the performances, the other part of this story is the blown leads. Not against these 5 teams necessarily, but specifically in some of the other games when you talk about, right, drop points. You had Brentford opening day of the season. Same thing against Southampton. They are not getting outplayed for 90 minutes. So there's a very easy way for me to see how this gets turned around quickly. And that starts with the very soft schedule they have coming up here, which is why I thought this was the perfect time to make the managerial change, because these are the games you got to pick up points. They got a brutal start. They didn't handle it well. Now you got to regroup and start getting some points on the board. The other part of this is James Maddison's the only player on this team with multiple goals in the Premier League. The striker position is unsettled at this point. Vardy has been okay, but he really has not gotten any of those. I mean, I can think of maybe one really good chance he's had this season. It is entirely possible this is the year where he falls off the cliff and Father Time finally gets the better of him. And absolutely, you should not be starting him every game the way things have gone so far. And to Brendan Rodgers' credit, he has not. He's tried some other things. But somebody needs to be, Harvey Barnes needs to be chipping in goals. The striker position needs to be a little bit more productive. You do have James Maddison playing really well, though, and that's a good starting point. The problem is nobody is really supporting him at this point. And the bottom line with this is, and I was sort of planning again to save some of this for when the managerial change happened, but I'll bring it, some of it out here. I understand the transfer window, that you had to sell Wesley Fofana to get a player in that was going to actually contribute to your team. Yes, that is frustrating. That is a problem. That does not explain going from a team that in a disappointing season finished 8th and got to a European semifinal to the worst team in the Premier League through 7 games. You will never be able to convince me this roster is a relegation candidate. I don't care if they get relegated. This squad is not relegation material. There are too many really gifted players. From Maddison to Barnes to Tillmans. You can throw Vardy in there, but you don't even have to. I mean, that midfield, and Kieran Dewsbury-Hall is very quickly becoming a good player too. Wilfred Ndidi hasn't been himself yet, so I'm not going to put him in that conversation. But there's too much talent. Brendan Rodgers has to be getting more out of this team. Plain and simple. To me, the transfer window conversation has to be had in the context of realistic expectations for this season and this idea that Leicester is supposed to be the team pushing the top 6 and fighting for European spots with the West Hams of the world. That is where you can have a conversation about the transfer window. That is not an explanation, much less an excuse for how horrific they've been defensively. It just isn't. That's the part of this that needs to get fixed. I still ultimately think they're going to be fine. The schedule has certainly had a part to play in this. They're not that far off. Certainly behind schedule, but not as behind schedule as it might look. But certainly teams that have gotten off to bad starts. I mean, Leicester's right at the top of the list. We'll stay in England for our final winner. Unsurprisingly, that is Arsenal. And I put Arsenal here for a more specific reason than, oh, look, they're atop the Premier League. Good for them. yes, I understand they don't have any impressive wins, and that was sort of the narrative coming out of the Manchester United game was, well, here's what happened when they played a real team. A game which they had a questionable goal taken away that would have been an opener. They did equalize. They played well. And they just didn't happen to win at Old Trafford. I mean, we got to put this in the right context. I didn't see anything coming out of that game that worried me about Arsenal. And coming with the whole strange scheduling due to the Queen's passing and the way things sort of shut down for a minute there, coming out of that Manchester United game and then getting a convincing win was massive. Because I talked about this in my Premier League preview. Arsenal's rough patches last season, right? The very beginning, the end of the season when they blew that top 4 spot, all sort of bunched together in these small little patches. All of their losses. They didn't just lose a game here and lose a game there. They lost 3-4 straight and then played really well for a while and lost 3-4 straight or 4 of 6 or whatever. That is the difference between finishing 5th and 6th or finishing, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and maybe even 1st. Still not convinced they can actually challenge for this title. So you got a disappointing loss in which you played well, and you came back and you took care of business. They have beaten every single team, not gotten points against them, beaten every single team they've supposed to this season. Manchester City can't say that. There's not another team in the Premier League, I would argue. I haven't actually sort of gone through and thought about that, and especially a team of Arsenal's stature who expects to win basically every time they take the field. Nobody else can say they've done exactly what they're supposed to so far. And then the final part of this, from a squad standpoint and a depth standpoint, which is a place Arsenal have sort of come up short in the past during this darker period since Arsene Wenger left. There's one person that comes to mind that I'm actually worried about Arsenal losing if I'm an Arsenal fan. That's Gabriel Jesus. He's been spectacular. He's a perfect fit. That was the piece that was missing. He is everything they expected and then some so far. Not having him for an extended stretch would worry me. But outside of that, I mean, you're talking about your other most important players here. Okay, Martin Odegaard, certainly. Emile Smith-Rowe is having difficulty getting playing time right now, let alone actually get into the starting lineup. Not that I'm going to sit here and say Emile Smith-Rowe is a competent replacement or an equal replacement for Martin Odegaard. But I don't feel terrible if that's the player you're bringing into the starting lineup. And it might not even be him if for some reason you do lose Odegaard. You have 3 center backs, one of whom is playing right back, which is then preventing your quality right back from getting on the field. You have 2 left backs. Every position. And, they've used multiple, we're up to probably 4 or 5, I think 5, fairly regular contributors at least in the midfield so far. It's not like it's 11 guys and then the squad falls off. They are prepared to handle a Europa League run. They're prepared to handle injuries, and that's not something you can necessarily say about Arsenal previously. But this is what happens when you're able to build a good roster, hold on to that roster, and then not just settle for that, but continue to build on top of it, which is exactly what they've done in bringing in a guy like Gabriel Jesus. You got to give managers time to figure this out, especially when they're young ones. I will give Arsenal all the credit in the world for sticking with Mikel Arteta when they would have been applauded by their fan base for firing him. You are not going to change everything that needs to be changed at a club in a position like Arsenal was overnight. Find somebody who you think is the guy moving forward and actually give them a chance to prove what they can do. Don't just make them your next scapegoat. when everything clicks and you finally get this cohesive unit from top to bottom in terms of your leadership, this is what happens. Loser number 3, Sevilla. 5th is this team has had 3 straight 4th place finishes. 9 straight seasons they have finished in the top 8 of La Liga. They are 15th right now, and they are conceding goals and quality chances left and right. The center back replacement has not worked. That's not necessarily a criticism of anybody in particular, be it the people assembling the squad or the players who have come in to replace Jules Koundé and Diego Carlos. It's just an unfortunate reality of being a club like Sevilla that they almost did too good of a job. And then you have to go do it again when ultimately the bigger clubs go and poach your players that you found. And sometimes you don't get it right and you pay a price for it. They have played Barcelona and Villarreal, plus Osasuna, who's off to a good start. So the schedule has not been incredibly easy where they're losing games to all these teams they have no business losing to. And again, there is plenty of time to turn this thing around and still finish at a respectable spot. I'm not worried about them getting relegated. But they have lost 7-0 combined against Manchester City and Barcelona. To me, that's just not something I associate with Sevilla. They don't necessarily win those games, but they're competitive. They make it difficult. And so far, that just hasn't happened. So that's really why I have them as a loser here, is the way they have started and how bad it's been has forced me to reevaluate what I expect from this club, at least in the short term this season. Because I, at the beginning, was more than happy to give them the benefit of the doubt. And, I had them in my preseason top 25, right where they kind of always are, that 15 to 18, 15 to 20 range. 4th best team in La Liga. They have been so consistent with that. And now you are in a position where you have work to do to make sure you even get into the Europa League. Because you could find yourself out of Europe here after the group stage of the Champions League, the way things have gone. And you're in danger of having one of those blah seasons where you're maybe trying to make a push at a Conference League spot or something, but that's not where this team is supposed to be. Maybe they turn this around quickly and get right back into at least a Europa League conversation. Maybe they drop to the Europa League and find a way to win the competition. Who knows? But it is fair to wonder at this point, is Sevilla still Sevilla? And that's ultimately why I have them as one of my losers. All right, we're going to take our first break here after finishing winners and losers. When we come back, U.S. men's national team time. Talk about these 2 games coming up against Japan, Saudi Arabia. Biggest questions: what do I want to see? What can we hope to get out of the team? What do we need to learn? What can we possibly learn heading into the World Cup with these final tune-ups? That is coming up after the break. You're watching the Touchline Talk Show. Don't go anywhere. And welcome back to the Touchline Talk Show. It is time to talk U.S. men's national team as we set the stage for these final 2 games before the World Cup. three specific sort of big picture things I am looking at in these two games that I think we can actually get a pretty good idea about. Because it is always fair to wonder how much can you really learn from friendlies, even ones this close to the World Cup, with teams, bringing in something that is going to look very close to their World Cup rosters. But there are some things I do think we can learn. My first big question, talking point, curiosity, whatever you want to frame it as, and it's something I've talked about before, but we're going to get two more examples of it, and that is simply, what does this team look like against World Cup opponents? Playing in CONCACAF, you get, I would argue, well, it's between 4 and 6 usually, right? World Cup qualifiers against something resembling a squad you would see in the World Cup. Mexico, certainly. Canada, certainly. And in the past, it's been a Costa Rica. This Costa Rica team did squeak in, but it's a different Costa Rica. So I would argue the U.S. got more like 4. And then, of course, you've got a Nations League final against Mexico and those kind of things. But you compare that to what you see in CONMEBOL, or especially in UEFA, where you're playing Nations League games and you're playing, Belgium, Poland, the Czech Republic, Ireland, and Iceland or something in your Nations League group. Or Switzerland, Sweden, Norway, England, and France. Something like that. You just get so much more exposure to other teams on your level, and that's not the case in CONCACAF, which makes these opportunities, and I talked about this the last window as well, to play other teams going to the World Cup really, really important. And the other thing that you are going to get a better idea of that is crucial heading into Qatar: can you play out of the back / win games multiple ways? Are you able to control tempo against teams like Japan and Saudi Arabia? These are perfect tests for this concept. Perfect ways to test this hypothesis. And it's especially important in this group the U.S. was drawn into, because you are not playing the same game against Iran and Wales that you are against England. I'm confident in this team's ability to play sort of the counter-attacking transition game they're going to have to against England. That part I feel really good about. Doesn't mean I'm going to pick them to win the game, but that's what the U.S. has always done at World Cups, right? They've always found a way to kind of rise to the occasion and play up to their opponents. This is the first team where you look at it on paper and go, they should be able to dictate the terms of, I would argue, both the Iran game and the Wales game, in part because of the way Wales play. Wales aren't interested in dictating the terms of games. They're interested in getting Gareth Bale 1v1, getting into set pieces, and limiting your chances and just kind of absorbing a bunch of pressure and making the game rather boring. It's incredibly effective, and as I've talked about before, it's incredibly effective at tournaments. So in games like that, can the U.S. play out of the back, maintain possession, build, and actually look comfortable with the ball? That's always been the big question about this team when they face better opponents, right? Can they do things with the ball? And this is the most technically gifted team they've ever had. So we're going to get to see what this looks like against two teams that are somewhere on the U.S.'s level. You can maybe, Saudi Arabia a little bit lower. But neither of these teams are going to sit back and just absorb a bunch of pressure. The U.S. is going to have to make things happen in these games. So that's my first question, is I just want to see against as many different World Cup opponents as possible, how effective is the U.S. in being able to implement a plan A and being able to do something other than play in transition and on the counter. Because you know that's going to be there. What happens in the two games where you're probably not going to be able to do that? And when teams are trying to do that against you? That's the question that is going to be vital to their World Cup success that we don't really know the answer to. And all we're doing is gathering more data to make a better, more informed hypothesis, because that answer is only going to be revealed at the World Cup. But the more data points you have, the better of an idea you have going in. Number 2. What does this look like without Nwsl? Who plays in that role? Johnny Cardoso is the guy who got brought in to replace him. I would have gone in a different direction probably, but we are where we are. I'm not here to talk about the squad at this point. I am much more interested in, okay, so how does that hole in the lineup get filled? Now that you have Weston McKennie and Tyler Adams there, along with Christian Pulisic and Gio Reyna and Brendan Aronson, what does Greg Berhalter decide to do? Is that Brendan Aronson? Is that Luca de la Torre? Is that Kellen Acosta? There are so many different ways Berhalter could go with that spot. And then the second part of this question for me is, can this team actually move the ball from back to front and, build out of the back and actually connect from one line to the next? Because that is something Nwsl is spectacular at. He is such a good ball carrier. He does so much of that work for you. And the U.S. don't have a long list of players capable of doing that the way Musa can. However, Luca de la Torre is one of them. That is also his great strength, right? Just his ability to take players on and to just bring the ball forward. A lot of the other players I mentioned, not exactly what they do. So that's where I am curious. Is it de la Torre? Because then you're doing the closest thing you can to a like-for-like swap. But if it's Brendan Aronson there, you're playing a whole different game. If it's Kellen Acosta there, you're playing a whole different game. And so the final question with that is, this is all preparation for a world in which Yunus Musah, for one reason or another, is unavailable at a World Cup game. You've got to have a plan B. I don't know what that plan B is. There are other, it's not that there isn't one. There are so many options and different ways Berhalter could go. Now you have 180 minutes to test these things and see which ones work and which ones don't. And then, third, of course, is the final roster spots. So I got some subcategories here. First, very simply, can Sam Vines lock down the second left back spot on this roster? I talked about this when the roster came out. Greg Berhalter, without really trying to sort of spin it or cushion it at all, said, we have 2 left-footed left backs we feel good about. We're going to bring a bunch of right-footers who can play on the left side if those guys aren't available. One of them isn't available in this window in Jedi Robinson. So Sam Vines is going to get at least one start, I have to believe. And just from a logical standpoint, if he is in this camp and Berhalter doesn't trust any other left-footed left back, you have to believe it's his spot to lose. Which then makes it another conversation of how does the right back spot end up playing, because Serginho Dest and Joe Scally can both play on the left, and you have Shaq Moore and Reggie Cannon and DeAndre Yedlin. I've talked about that a little bit before. I'm not going to get into it here. But there is sort of a knock-on effect from this Sam Vines situation. He's playing the best soccer of his life. If you want players in form going to the World Cup, Sam Vines is on your squad. And also, The Joe Scally experiment didn't go so well. It's one game. I'm not going to put a huge amount of stock into it long term. But we're talking about the World Cup was 5-6 months or whatever away when that happened. And now we're talking 2. You don't have time for a guy to learn on the fly. Ideally, this player is not on the field very much at all because Jedi Robinson is playing every single game. But again, in that situation, you have to be prepared. And I will be concerned if Sam Vines is not on this team because every indication from his performance to what Greg Berhalter has been saying to the actual roster pool available suggests he is that second left back. I want to see what he looks like with this team, and I want to see if he lives up to those expectations. Then you go to the center backs. Whether you like it or not, whether you agree or disagree, Walker Zimmerman and Aaron Long are going to Qatar. That is essentially a lock in my head at this point, based on what Greg Berhalter is doing. Not my personal opinion, just Greg Berhalter's the one putting this roster together. Those 2 guys are going. Those are his top 2 center backs. After that, it gets a lot more interesting. And so it spoke volumes that Cameron Carter-Vickers and Chris Richards were the guys who got called into this camp. And then both of them had to pull out. And so now Eric Palmer-Brown and Mark McKenzie are in this camp. I would like to point out here, to take a second to point out, Celtic did lose to St. Mirren without Cameron Carter-Vickers. Do with that as you please. I just did think it was worth pointing out. A team that has been so dominant in the Scottish Premiership does lose to, it wasn't a loss to Rangers. They dominated Rangers and Cameron Carter-Vickers played. I'm not saying they lost because he wasn't there, but it's an interesting little tidbit I wanted to throw in here. And going back to what Berhalter said when he announced this squad, I am of the belief that these 4 guys I mentioned, Palmer Brown, McKenzie, Carter-Vickers, and Richards, are battling for those final 2 center back spots. Greg Berhalter essentially said, Tim Ream's good at a lot of things. He's not very good at the things we need our center backs to be good at. That does not sound like somebody Greg Berhalter is interested in taking, again, whether you agree or not. We can only have so much conversation about who should go. At some point, you got to start talking about what this is actually going to look like and what Greg Berhalter thinks. So it was not surprising at all to me that these are the 2 guys who got the call. And you look at their club situations, and Chris Richards isn't playing. Cameron Carter-Vickers is. And I think Cameron Carter-Vickers was in a really good position, and still is, to make this team. In terms of getting left out and having to back out of this camp, I am much more concerned if I'm Chris Richards than if I'm Cameron Carter-Vickers. And so you're talking about 2 guys, in Eric Palmer-Brown and Mark McKenzie, who are playing regularly in Europe. Now, they're not in the Premier League like Richards. They're not in the Champions League like Carter-Vickers. But if you're Greg Berhalter and you're looking at this in terms of your center backs, and either Palmer-Brown or McKenzie impresses you in this camp and continues to play well for their club in the next month and a half, it is going to be hard for Chris Richards to convince you he deserves a spot. Chris Richards essentially at this point is banking, unless he somehow finds a way to work into the Crystal Palace team, is banking on the resume he already has and the goodwill he's built up to make this roster. It's unfortunate. It's not fair because Greg Berhalter wanted to give him this opportunity and the injury prevented it. But it is the reality of this situation when you only have this one window left. So, I'm still looking at this as Eric Palmer-Brown and Mark McKenzie have work to do to prove to Greg Berhalter they should be 4th or 3rd on the depth chart, not 5th or 6th. But if one of them can make that jump and convince Berhalter in this camp, I think it's going to be difficult for Chris Richards to retake that spot from them. So that's a really interesting dynamic of this for me as well. Then we get to, of course, the strikers. Ricardo Pepe, scoring goals again, in good form, seems to be in a much better place now he's in the Eredivisie. So he gets this call, and like I said before, Greg Berhalter wanted to give him this opportunity. I am not convinced that means he is determined to have Ricardo Pepe on the World Cup team. I guess I'll put it that way. What I think it means is Greg Berhalter wanted to give Ricardo Pepe a chance to prove he deserves that spot. There was not another player Berhalter said, we already know what he can do and didn't feel like we needed to see anything from him in this camp. That is what he said about Jordan Pefok. So, as somebody who takes people at their word and takes things literally, I see Pefok as the most likely guy to get on the plane that is not in this camp or was not originally called into this camp. For that reason, that I think is very valid. Greg Berhalter knows exactly who he is. He's watching him perform well in the Bundesliga week in and week out. When Greg Berhalter put this roster together, nobody had any idea what Ricardo Pepe was because he's been out of the picture and he hasn't scored a goal in so long. And his club situation was so messy. So this is the one spot where I'm hesitant to put an incredible amount of stock in the fact that Berhalter picked Pepe over Pefok. That being said, if Pepe performs well here and then goes back to the Netherlands and continues to perform well, I think what we learned is that Berhalter's preference is for Pepe to be that guy. I haven't backed away from that. My opinion, the ultimate takeaway I had from that press conference, like I said last week, he knows what he wants and he's going to stick to it, whether you like it or not. But Pepe actually has to prove he can give Berhalter what Berhalter wants. And that's where I'm kind of, at this point, Berhalter would prefer to have Pepe. I don't think he is determined to take Pepe if Pepe is not in form, if it's not clicking. And then there's Josh Sargent. Josh Sargent scoring boatloads of goals for Norwich City in the championship. Maybe I'm forgetting something, but I can't really point to a single moment in Josh Sargent's national team career where I've been impressed by him and went, wow, he really performed well in this window, in these couple games. I really feel like he is starting to fit in and do the things the striker is asked to in this system. On paper, from a profile standpoint, Josh Sargent is exactly the kind of player Greg Berhalter wants. And this was always supposed to be his position. He was always the future number 9, right? And it just wasn't working at the club level or the international level. And so you had to go look at different places. I am hesitant to go say, because he's scoring and playing well in the championship, that means all of these questions we've had about Josh Sargent when it comes to the national team are just gone. It could be very well be he has just found a completely new level of confidence, whatever it might be, and he looks the part in this camp, and that's that he's going on the plane. But think about how many goals Jordan Pefok would score in the championship. He did it in Switzerland, and now he's doing it in Germany. You can compare his numbers to Josh Sargent's, right? They both played in the Bundesliga. Context is a little bit different. I get all that. I'm not necessarily saying it's apples to apples. You get my point, though. Me personally, I need to see something from Josh Sargent to justify taking him over Jordan Pefok. And I think that's how most of the people who follow this U.S. men's national team feel. Is frustration that Pefok wasn't on this team. I will go back to what I said before, though. I don't think this is done and dusted. If I have to pick one guy who works his way onto the plane, it's going to be Jordan Peacock. But this camp is about Berhalter getting a look at the strikers. I mean, Jesus Ferreira is probably going to be the starter. I think you can at least write that in pencil, if not pen. So you're bringing him because you want him in these final tune-up games. And you weren't bringing 4 strikers, so all of a sudden you had to choose 2. And Berhalter picked the guys who have sort of this opportunity to reprove themselves and who weren't doing things at the club level to get themselves in a position to be part of this team for the past year or so. I have no issue with that whatsoever. But it leads to a very interesting conversation based on how these 2 guys play and how many minutes they get. Because if Ferreira starts one game and let's say Pepe gets 45 minutes in the other one and Sargent takes the second half, so they play somewhere between 45 and 60 minutes apiece, how much did you really learn about them? So I'm also curious what Berhalter does with his strikers. Because there's a real argument. Pepe should be starting one game, Sargent should be starting the other. Jesus Ferreira has nothing to prove here. He needs to be there to continue to build camaraderie, right? The 20 or so guys you know are going to the World Cup should be in this camp, and that's exactly what Berhalter did. Doesn't mean you need to play something close to starting lineup both games when you have so many different decisions to make at the striker position involving guys both in and out of this camp. So that is also part of this. It's going to be a conversation until somebody just cements themselves as the guy moving forward and everybody is in agreement with that. Because I would argue Jesus Ferreira has. Nobody seems to be really sold on it, though. So we will see how these strikers do, how they're used, and what the conversation is. Because it's going to be another point of contention when the final roster comes out. Who of the strikers made it? Who didn't? Did Jordan Peacock find a way to work himself back in? Should Jordan Peacock be on the team? All that's going to come back up. But all of this is more data points to be able to have a better idea of what this is going to look like and to better analyze the final decisions Greg Berhalter makes. That's what this is about. From a team perspective, again, you got 2 World Cup opponents here. Terrific place to experiment and to try and test some hypotheses. You're missing a couple starters in Anthony Robinson, Jedi Robinson, Nwsl. How do those guys do? Who steps up and takes those spots? What does it look like in a world where those guys aren't available? And then the 2 big, the goalkeepers you can also throw in here. The injuries, and it's just kind of strange because they weren't all available for this, right? I think Zach Steffen's in this camp if Zach Steffen is healthy. Whether he should be or not, different conversation. But to me, this is really about the center backs because of the way that all played out with the unfortunate injuries, and the strikers because of the PFOC conversation. That is all I've got on the U.S. men's national team. Plenty of content will be coming after these games. Don't you worry about that. We're going to take one more break here and then finish the show off with the weekend look ahead. Going to put a spotlight on the NWSL. It's been a while since we've done that. And also highlight some of the more high-profile international games happening this weekend during the international break. You're watching the Touchline Talk Show. Don't go anywhere. And welcome back to the Touchline Talk Show. One final time, we're going to jump right into the weekend look ahead, starting with the NWSL. Because we don't have other leagues to talk about because of the international break, I want to take a minute here to sort of reset things and set the stage for what should be a very exciting end to the NWSL regular season. 4 points separate first place San Diego from 6th place Chicago, your number 1 seed and your final team in the playoffs. 2 of the teams in that top 6, Portland and OL Reign, have a game in hand on the other 4. 7th and 8th place, Angel City, 4 points back, North Carolina Courage, 5 points back, both have a game in hand on Chicago in that final playoff spot. Those games in hand are going to be made up tonight. As we're talking right now and sort of throughout the evening, your games tonight. OL Reign at New York, New Jersey Gotham, North Carolina Courage at Orlando, Louisville at Portland, Washington Spirit at Angel City. So then everybody is going to be set for these final 2 weeks of the season. Everybody's got those 2 games left. So Saturday and Sunday. Saturday, New York, New Jersey at North Carolina Courage. OL Reign at Houston. That's a massive one. And then Sunday, Chicago at Portland. Also massive. Washington and Kansas City Current. San Diego Wave at Orlando. And Louisville City at Angel City. So what you have this weekend is plenty of matchups between teams that are near each other in the table. Tonight is about, can the teams that are in the playoff position sort of cement that? Can you do your job in games you're supposed to win? Because you can look at all of these games tonight and on paper, there's a team that should win them. Then you get to games like Chicago at Portland and OL Reign at Houston Dash, and that's where it gets really interesting this weekend. So it's a different conversation than the games tonight when you get to this weekend, but should be really, really good action. Worth tuning in if you're wondering what to do with your life because you don't have Premier League to watch, don't have MLS to watch, NWSL right here for you as they get ready to conclude their season here. And then just some international games I wanted to highlight. Good example of what I was talking about earlier with this idea that you get to play so many high-quality teams in a region like UEFA. England at Italy on Friday. Italy didn't even make the World Cup. But this is just a Nations League game. England gets to play, right? Then you got Switzerland at Spain. Another 2 terrific teams headed to the World Cup. You get all these kind of games all the time in Europe. You just don't get them in CONCACAF. And then perhaps the most interesting one of the weekend, Belgium at Netherlands on Sunday. And then some other ones to highlight. Friday, outside of Europe, Korea, Costa Rica, Iran, Uruguay, Canada, Qatar, Brazil, Ghana. So plenty of teams in the World Cup trying to get those final games scheduled against other teams going to the World Cup, just like the United States did, to get yourself as ready as possible. This Canada-Qatar game has had plenty of controversy with it. You can go read more about that. But there is still plenty of soccer out there. Just looks a little bit different this weekend. That is all for this evening's show. Thank you so much for tuning in. Be sure to hit that subscribe button. You can find all of the written work I've done on both Substack, touchlinetalk.substack.com, as well as Medium. Now I'm slowly working to get everything there. We're sort of doing it in chunks, but slowly but surely, soccer content is coming to Medium as well. That is all for this edition of the Touchline Talk